Thank you, everyone. My name is Louise Pfeiffer, and I will be your MC this evening. To begin, I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country. As we come together today, we pause to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging leaders. Tonight's event is being held at Inperilla, which opened in October 2021 as a new home for the White Trust. Inperilla is a co-working space for a diverse range of philanthropic and community organisations with shared values and common purpose. As Director of Philanthropy for The Life You Can Save, I've shared this co-working space since January this year, and I'm excited to be hosting an event with you here tonight. A couple of housekeeping items. This evening will be documented by Sonda Creative, and if you'd like to opt out of appearing in the production, please put a red sticker on your name badge and you'll be removed from the final footage. The red stickers are back where you checked in. No one will look if you run up and grab one. The toilets are to my left and there's some out the back. The emergency exits are in that direction and also where in the door that you came in. There are a number of volunteers around as well if there's any other matters that arise that you need assistance with. The proceedings are as follows. I will introduce Peter Singer to give his address, and there will be a generous amount of time for you to ask Peter questions. At the conclusion of formalities at around 6:30 p.m, additional food will be served and wine, and the evening will wrap up at 7. To introduce Peter, I will start with his biography, then share a bit about my connection with his work before asking him to come to the stage, the lectern. Peter Singer is a world-renowned philosopher and bioethicist whose writings have been foundational to both the effective altruism movement and the modern animal rights movement. Pete Singer has authored and edited more than 50 books, including his seminal book works on effective giving, The Life You Can Save, How to Do Your Part to End World Poverty, published in 2009 and a fully revised edition in 2019, and The Most Good You Can Do, which was published in 2015. And his writings have appeared in more than 25 languages. In 2013 in the US and 2019 in Australia, Singer founded the non-profit The Life You Can Save, which is where I now work, to help spread his ideas about giving to help the world's extreme poor. The Life You Can Save, the non-profit organisation, distributes copies of the book and also has a website that offers a curated list of high-impact charities. The Life You Can Save, the organisation provides free tools and resources to help donors, family officers and foundations give with confidence. And we process millions of dollars for high-impact charities annually at no charge to donors or the charities themselves. In 2021, Singer was awarded the Bergeron Prize for Philosophy and Culture in recognition of his widely influential and intellectually rigorous work in reinvigorating utilitarianism as part of academic philosophy and as a force of change in the world. In accordance with his ethical views, Singer donated the entire US $1 million prize to effective organisations such as The Life You Can Save, to assist people in extreme poverty and to reduce the suffering of animals in factory farms. Singer was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1946 and educated at the University of Melbourne and the University of Oxford. Singer currently teaches at Princeton University, whereas the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at the University Centre for Human Values. When he's not writing or conducting research or appearing at the Adelaide Writers' Week, Singer enjoys hiking, surfing, and spending time with his wife Renata, 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren. Now, for my own connection. As I mentioned, as of May 2022, I commenced working at The Life You Can Save. Yet my history with Peter Singer's ideas goes back much further. In fact, I stand before you tonight with a deep sense of gratitude and admiration for the person who has profoundly inspired my journey towards ethical consciousness and philanthropy. In 1995, I had the privilege of studying Peter Singer's work at the University of Adelaide, just down the road here. His seminal book, Animal Liberation, challenged me to re-examine my beliefs about non-human animals and led to making different choices about the food I eat and the clothes I wear. Yet it was his later book, The Life You Can Save, first published in 2009, that left another indelible mark on me. I confess that I was initially apprehensive about reading it, knowing that Peter Singer's arguments would likely compel me to take a different course of action and to therefore make changes in my life. But when I finally read it in 2011, the power of its arguments hit me with full force. I became one of many, thousands upon thousands of people who have been moved by the book into action. And I became an everyday philanthropist. No foundation, no inherited wealth, no remarkable founder journey, just an ordinary Australian empowered with the knowledge on how to do extraordinary, meaningful things through giving to help people living in extreme poverty. Copies of the book are available for guests as a gift, and you may like to take the opportunity to shoulder your way to have Peter to sign a copy this evening while he's here. In tonight's discussion on practical ethics and global poverty, we have the opportunity to engage with Peter Singer and gain deeper insights into many pressing issues, some of which I've mentioned now. So let us embrace this rare moment with open hearts and minds, and may we leave here tonight feeling inspired to take action towards creating a better world. Peter.
Thank you so much, Louise, for that generous introduction. Thank you also for organising this event, and prior to organising it, thanks for twisting my arm and saying, oh, I'm coming to Adelaide for the Writers' Festival. I've got to do something for the life you can save while I'm here. And I'm really pleased to have that opportunity to do that, and I thank the White Trust as well for the facilities that they've provided for this. And I thank you all for coming, because there would be no point in talking if there were not an audience. Louise, also in what she just said about how she came to be where she is an excellent sort of poster person for the idea that philosophy can make a difference. And a lot of people are skeptical about that. Even when I started studying philosophy myself as an undergraduate at the University of Melbourne and then as a graduate student at the University of Oxford, a lot of people thought, well, why are you doing this? You're just sort of spinning theories. What difference does it make? But that, in fact, was a time in the end of the 1960s, the 70s, when philosophy was actually starting to already get involved in real-world issues. It was the time of the Vietnam War, when there were teach-ins discussing whether this is a justifiable war, and that's clearly an ethical question. And in fact, the so-called just war theorists have been discussing that question since medieval times. There was the civil rights movement, and so there was already starting to be a role for philosophy to actually get into world issues, sometimes called practical ethics or applied ethics. And that's, although I've done other areas of philosophy, that's really what I've got most into, and where I have been able to have the kind of impact that Louise described in changing people's views on a range of issues. And of course, the issue I'm going to talk about now in the next few minutes is about essentially how to live an ethical life if you are a member of an affluent society and you're not at the very bottom of that society economically. And Australia clearly is an affluent society, and there are some people in poverty for whom this kind of appeal wouldn't really make sense, because they're struggling to feed themselves, feed and house and clothe themselves, and they're struggling to do that for their children and for their children to get an education. But still, we are a society that is a very fortunate society, and most of the people, I dare say perhaps all of the people in this room and those that you know, do have resources to spend on things that are not simply part of the struggle to survive that is a reality for many people in the world today. And that gives us choices about what we are going to do with those resources. And once you have those choices, you have an ethical issue as to what to do with them. And especially you have an ethical issue if you're living in a world in which there are people who are comfortably off, as most Australians are by global standards, and that's true throughout the world. There's at least 1 billion people like that. But there are also a very substantial number of people who are in extreme poverty, using that term as defined by the World Bank to mean they do not have the resources to reliably feed, shelter themselves and their families and educate their children, get some even very basic health care. So I think that fact about the world, coupled with the fact that we have the ability to make a difference, if we were living again, sort of go back to medieval times, even if we'd known about other people far from us in extreme poverty, and even if we had been wealthy and had some extra resources, we probably could not have moved our resources in a helpful way to where they were needed. But this is a very different world. We know what is going on in many parts of the world instantly, and we have the resources to make a difference very quickly. So the question then is, well, what should we be doing about it? Now, Louise mentioned the book that you've got over there, The Life You Can Save, which came out in 2009. But I, in fact, started writing about this quite a long time before that. While I was still in Oxford, there was a crisis that occurred in what is now Bangladesh, but was then East Pakistan. Pakistan then consisted of two geographically distinct areas. And essentially, what is now Pakistan, but was known as West Pakistan then, was ruling over East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh. But there was a strong movement for autonomy in East Pakistan, and there were reasonably democratic elections which elected a party that was committed to seeking greater autonomy. But instead of responding to that, Pakistan as a nation, dominated by West Pakistan, sent in troops to put down the movement for autonomy and put it down very brutally. And the result of that brutal repression was that 9 million people fled across the border to India to escape that repression. And India, which was a much poorer country then than it is today, appealed for assistance to the wealthier world, and some assistance was forthcoming. Oxfam, for example, was holding appeals to help people, but it was not nearly enough. And that led me to start thinking about what are my obligations. I was then a graduate student, but even as a graduate student on a scholarship, and my wife was working as a high school teacher near Oxford, we had resources. We were able to take holidays across to the continent in the summer, so on. So, what should I be doing? What should I be thinking about this issue? And some people would say, well, look, it's not our responsibility. We had nothing to do with the fact that there was this repression and now there's these refugees and they're in need. So why should I have anything to do with it? And when people were said to that, I thought about, well, what's a case where you surely wouldn't just say because you weren't the cause of the thing, you have no responsibility to do something. And Oxford, I don't know if some of you have been there, has a lot of colleges with beautiful grounds and gardens, and some of them have ornamental ponds in those gardens. And I thought, suppose you were sitting in the garden, as I sometimes did, of a college, enjoying your lunch, let's say, or walking past, and you saw a toddler fall into the pond. And you know that the pond is a shallow one, that you could jump into the pond and would only be waist deep, but this toddler is going to drown. And of course you'd think, where are the parents or the babysitter or something? But for some reason you have no idea why, there's nobody there rushing in to rescue the child. So could you say, well, I don't have anything to do with this, therefore I'll just ignore it and go on with eating my lunch or just walk on? Of course not. I think everybody would think that would be a horrible thing to do. But if that's the case, then sure, the child is in front of you. I understand that emotionally it's very different from not donating to refugees in India. But if you know that your donations can save lives, can improve people's lives, is it okay to just sit on your hands and say, well, it's none of my business, I'm not responsible for it? So that was an article that I wrote and that got published. It was called Famine, Affluence and Morality. It was published in 1972. So it goes back a long time. And to some extent, it was a bit of a sleeper. I mean, it did get published. Some philosophers talked about it. It got reprinted in some anthologies that we used for classroom use for students to discuss. But It certainly didn't trigger a movement in the 1970s or the 1980s or even the 1990s. And I'm not sure exactly why that it happened, but in the noughts of this century, some people who had been reading this as students reacted a little differently from students who reacted before, because a lot of students had discussed it and thought about whether it was right or wrong, but not really done anything about it. But a particular student at Oxford who's called Toby Ord, who actually is another Australian from Melbourne, had read it and decided that he would do some research into what would actually be the most effective thing he could do with the money that he could spare. And he looked around at different charities and he found that there were huge differences in how much you could do with various sums of money. And I'll give you the example that he came up with. And I don't want to put down any charities that are doing good jobs, but just as a realistic example, he looked at how much it costs to train a guide dog for a visually impaired person, and how much good you could do by donating to that organisation. And it turns out to be surprisingly expensive. The figure that he came up with a decade or so ago was $40,000 US to train one guide dog and one person to work with a guide dog and improve the life of a visually impaired person. Okay, still a good thing to do, still a much better thing to do than many people who have $40,000 to spare do. But he also looked at, can we do anything about some of the principal causes of blindness? And the cause that he focused on is trachoma. Trachoma does exist in Australia among some of our Indigenous people, but it's pretty rare here. It's much more widespread in some of the impoverished regions of North Africa, for example. It's prevalent in hot, dry, dusty places where there is little health care and little hygiene. And it's caused by a microorganism that gets into your eye and very slowly, progressively leads to blurred vision and then over some decades to blindness. But it turns out that it's very cheap to actually treat and cure. Toby came across an article in a peer-reviewed medical journal saying that the cost of preventing blindness from trachoma was $25 per case prevented. Now, you know, that figure no doubt has risen as costs have risen, but also as the low-hanging fruit gets picked, the places where it's most concentrated, it gets a little bit more expensive to treat. But you can see that even if it now costs $100 per case of blindness prevented, for the cost of training one guide dog, you could prevent 400 people becoming blind. And I think when you think about that, it's pretty clear that preventing 400 people becoming blind is a better thing to do than improving the life of one visually impaired person. So Toby, realising this enormous difference and the importance of finding which are the most effective charities, started a movement called Giving What We Can, in which he publicised these facts and asked people to pledge to donate 10% of their income to charity. And around the same time, I think more or less independently, but very helpfully, a couple of young whiz kids working at a hedge fund in the US wondered what they should do with their astonishingly large salaries, given that they were only in their mid-20s, and sort of got together and said, well, what would be a good thing to do? And they asked a few other people around and they suggested various charities, but they realised they didn't actually have any data. They looked at the charities' websites and information, but there wasn't any good data about how much good you were doing with donation to these charities. So being sort of data people, that was what they were doing for a living, they thought there's a vacuum here that should be filled, and two of them went off to start an organisation called GiveWell, which started doing research on different organisations and how effective they are. And in The Life You Can Save, in the first edition as well as the revised one, I talked a bit about GiveWell and about some of their charities, and tried to encourage people to think about what we ought to do to live an ethical life. So after the book was published, a little bit after, I was contacted by a man called Charlie Bressler, who I didn't know at all, but who said that he'd had a career in the men's retail outlet. He was actually president of a nationwide men's clothing chain, but somehow this had never fulfilled his values, really, selling more suits to men. And he wanted, I think he was maybe 60 or something by then, he wanted still to make a difference, and offered assistance in setting up an organisation. He'd been running a large organisation, setting up an organisation to spread the ideas of The Life You Can Save, of the book, and encourage more people to follow it. So that's what happened, and that's the organisation that Louise mentioned that she's working for, and a relatively small staff that we have. But we are trying to promote these ideas of, firstly, that we have the resources to give, secondly, that we can make a really big difference to people's lives if we find the best organisations, thirdly, that there is research that can help us to find those best organisations. It's not hard, you don't have to do it all yourself from scratch, you can find it online. And we started aggregating some of that research so that we curate our own list of about 20 so organisations that have been independently assessed and verified as offering extremely good value for money. And we have more recently, and I was speaking to Anna, where's Anna, somewhere in the room, Anna Dumont, who's over there, who's been involved in this. We've started doing some of our own research to fill gaps that we think GiveWell and other organisations were not actually doing. So we're encouraging people to look for these organisations and donate to them. They can donate directly through our website. As Louise said, we don't take any cut for that. We rely for our operations budget, our staff, we rely on other donors who understand what we're doing and understand that giving to us is a way of getting leverage to do even more good. Because over the past 3 years, we've just a running average, we can track $17 in donations going to the charities we recommend for every dollar we spend on the rather modest salaries we pay to Louise or Anna or some of the other people in the organisation. So we think that that's a good opportunity as well. But essentially what I want to do is to spread the message of the organisations that we're supporting and working for. So there's a range of them. I started with the example of treating trachoma, and we do have a couple of organisations that are involved in either preventing blindness or restoring sight. Many of you would be familiar with the Fred Hollows Foundation, as that's one of the Australian originating organisations that we have on our list. And they do both the preventative work and, of course, they do work in restoring sight from people who have gone blind, particularly elderly people. If you develop cataracts here, you can get them removed pretty easily. If you're in some of the poorer countries and you're not among the better off people in those countries, you can't do that. So quite simple and again inexpensive operations to restore sight. We can also save lives. One of the effective organisations we recommend saving lives is the Against Malaria Foundation, because malaria is still a major killer in parts of the world, particularly kills children. Adults, of course, get malaria and it weakens them and may make it difficult for them to work, but it's children who are mostly the ones killed by it. And again, there's very clear, verifiable research showing that distributing bed nets is an inexpensive way of saving lives. That you have to distribute them. Of course, you have to have local people going into the villages, showing people how to use them, explaining how they're important, but people understand that and they want that, and they want to protect themselves and their children from malaria. And they use them, and it's demonstrable that when you go into a village and do that, the child mortality rate falls. So that's another thing that another organisation that we support. There are other ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of. We support an organisation called Development Media International, which uses very inexpensive radio spots to provide health information to people in poorer countries. So they started out in Burkina Faso, and again, it was possible to do a real trial to demonstrate the effectiveness of what they were doing, because there are local radio stations, so they got health measures from different areas. They put their spots randomly on some of the local stations and not on others, and sure enough, you find out that the health statistics improve, the mortality rates drop in those regions where these radio spots are going out. People learn to recognise, for example, the conditions that are going to be dangerous for them and their children, and to get themselves to the local clinic in the region, which may not be an easy thing to do for them because they may not have access to transport to it, but if they recognise that they have something that could kill them or one of their children, they'll make the effort to do it, whereas if they don't know that, then they may not. And in fact, this organisation proved particularly helpful then when the COVID pandemic started, because they were able to spread information across the country. By now they'd realised that what they were doing works, so they were doing it across the country and starting to do it in other countries, to warn people about COVID and about what the symptoms of COVID were and the way that you could reduce the likelihood that you would get it. We also have organisations like Village Enterprise that are trying to help people work themselves out of poverty. We have ways of helping them to firstly get a small amount of capital to start some sort of small business. Secondly, the organisation encourages them to set up village saving schemes to get together with other villages. It's usually organised through women to have a kind of pool of savings that they can draw on if they need to for their business and repay. And then there's mentoring on how to start a business, how to run a business. If you have problems, somebody you can talk to about it. And again, that has been shown to help people escape poverty in an effective manner. So these are just some examples of the kind of cost-effective charities that we are supporting. They're not always the ones that are the most saleable to the public. Some of them are, some of them less so, because there are people like to help, just as in a way like the pond example, people like to help the people they can see in their own area locally, and people like to get some sort of response from the child. There have been these charities for many years where you sponsor a child in a village, and then you get a letter from the child, but it's been shown that that doesn't really help as much as helping the village as a whole, because there may be problems in the village, may not have safe drinking water, and you can't overcome that problem by helping one child. And also, of course, if some children are getting foreign assistance and others are not, that can lead to jealousy and rivalry and so on. So generally those charities are at least softening what they're doing and not simply supporting individual children, which is a good thing. But when you donate to the Against Malaria Foundation, for example, you will never know which child your life has saved. You can't, because obviously not all the children in these areas were dying, so you can't say, now I've saved their life because there's a bed net that's protecting children in this village. Maybe they wouldn't have died, but statistically that some would have if you distribute enough bed nets. So what we're trying to promote is to think about cost effectiveness in particular, to think about how I can make the biggest difference with the resources that I've got. And that should be a message that's easy to get across, because after all, when it comes to buying things for yourself, you need a new phone. Well, how much have you got to spend on a phone? What kind of phone is going to give you what you need? You'll ask your friends. You might do a bit of online research as to what gives you the best value for your money. That's pretty natural. But curiously, when people donate to charity, they don't do that research. They give much more impulsively. They give because they've seen a photo of a smiling child, and that moves them to give. Or they give because their neighbour or friend says, I give to this charity, I think that they're a good organisation. Well, how do you know they're a good organisation? If you haven't done some research, you probably don't really know. So we're trying to encourage a somewhat more critical, evidence-based approach to charity. And we think we're making some headway. We're certainly growing in the amount that we're being able to shift each year. As I said, we started in about 2000, the book came out in 2009, I guess we got going in 2010 or maybe 2011. By the time we got set up as a tax-deductible charity in the US and here. So I think we've given something in the around the $80 to $85 million range overall in these years, which is good, but you know, there's a huge amount more out there that we would like to tap and like to get into. So that's really what I want to talk to you about. I hope that you'll share our perspective about how to give, and if you think so, then please support us in what we do. Have a look at the website, thelifeyoucansave.org. Grab the book as you go. I will be happy to sign them if you want, and give us your feedback on how we're doing and what we could do better. Thanks very much.
The first thing that I wanted to say, having brought my 16-year-old vegetarian self along to this evening, is thank you very much for the book Animal Liberation. And in a way, I suppose it kind of goes to my question about this work. In reality, I've made a decision to become a vegetarian, and what your book gave me was an intellectual framework to hang around that I could use to explain my choice to people. The question that I have this evening, and you've touched on it already, but I'd love to hear you speak more deeply about it, is the tension that can operate between why people choose to give and giving better. And I think about sort of the Philanthropy Australia here has sort of a vision of more and better philanthropy. But if I think about what I observe as being the motivations for people's giving, and then I think about how that overlays with your thesis in terms of the Venn diagram, they strike me as being areas of commonality and areas of distinction. And if I can explore that in your story of the toddler, I think, yes, the reason that you may rescue the toddler would be because you wanted to rescue the toddler, although arguably maybe we should all be down at the beach now, scouting for people who are about to drown. But there are also all of these other reasons why you might do it. You don't want to be the person who's sitting there eating your lunch and somebody else comes along and sees the toddler and suddenly you're dealing with their condemnation, or lunch is ruined already, and so you may as well get up. The story about, you know, the choosing your phone, we can hang our rational reasons around our choices, but there are often also emotional or irrational reasons that sit around that. And so again, getting back to the why people give versus how people give, I'd love to hear you talk more about the possible tensions that operate between the two and how giving better might actually, could it possibly serve sometimes as a disincentive because it runs counter to the other motivators that we bring to the decision.
You're right, there is the tension that you've referred to, and I briefly mentioned. And I think it is a serious problem because very often it's a problem of distance. As I said, the toddler is in front of you. You see that child. So there's a very strong visceral pull, you know. I think in evolutionary terms, we have evolved to be social animals, to live in small groups. And so we have evolved a response to help those who are close to us in our group. But we've not evolved something about helping people who are distant because, as I said, you know, most of our prehistory and history, we haven't really been able to do that. And now we have even greater problems, not only that the distance is greater, but we don't see them, but also there's the question of time as a distance. And that's particularly an issue now because of climate change. And I think that's one reason why that's a really hard issue to raise money for. We do now have a couple of climate-related charities recommended by The Life You Can Save because climate change is going to do much more harm to people in extreme poverty than it is to the affluent. They're going to have fewer choices as to where to go. A lot of them are going to become climate refugees. But when you say, the greenhouse gases we're emitting now are going to damage the planet for centuries to come, it's very hard for people to relate to that, and yet that seems to me to be a very important issue. You mentioned my work on animals, and that's again another case where the organisations that can relatively easily raise money for animals are the organisations working for dogs and cats and for attractive exotic wildlife, pandas, seals and so on. The organisations that are working for chickens in factory farms, which in terms of numbers overwhelmingly outweigh all the domestic dogs and cats and the pandas and a lot of other endangered species as well, they get much less sympathy. And if you try to talk about the suffering of fish in aquaculture, you're even further away than you were with chickens, unfortunately. So it is a problem, and I don't think that there's an easy solution. I'm hoping that we can at least get a segment of the population. I guess we have a segment of the population, but it's a small one, but we can get a much larger segment of the population that is aware of the importance of giving effectively and trying to think where your donations can do the most good, save the most lives, relieve the most suffering, and that we can therefore move quite large amounts of money in the long run to the most effective charities and to the most effective causes. But there will be some people who won't respond to that, I think. Maybe people who are just more guided by their what pulls on their emotions. Is it a tension? I'm not sure if you were suggesting this, but is it a tension where we actually are going to get less money donated as a whole? Well, possibly. I don't know. I hope that that's not the case. But even if that were the case, if you have this kind of difference that, let's just go back to Toby Ord's example, and let's assume, if you like, that the improvement in the life of a visually impaired person by getting a guide dog is just as great as not becoming blind at all. Even if you count that as one, it's still 400 to 1 ratio of how much more good you're doing. So suppose that you halved the amount of money that's donated, but it went to the most effective way of preventing blindness, you would still be doing a couple of 100 times as much good. So I would be prepared to take that reduction. I would hope it wouldn't happen, but if somebody convinced me that it was happening, I would still think it's important to get the money to the most effective charities, and you hope that would mean you're doing a lot more good.
And my question is embarrassing, and it's embarrassing for me, not for you. So just and because it's a personal question, it's about the fact that you write about and live an ethical life. Do you find that journalists and critics, who are not necessarily the same group, actually look for flaws in your personal life to go kind of give you gotcha moments? Does that ever happen?
I once said something, and somebody wrote a letter to The Age, which The Age published, saying that I drive a Mercedes, which was just completely untrue. I've never owned or driven a Mercedes at all, and I had to write a letter which The Age eventually published saying that was false. But yes, occasionally that does happen. But look, my response to that is, I'm not a saint. I don't give every last dollar that I can spare to effective charities. That's true. I do treat my children and grandchildren and my wife, I guess, better than I treat strangers in terms of distributing resources. So I'm not preaching for that kind of saintly level of impoverishing yourself to help others. I admit that there's a couple of lines in the 1972 article, which I wrote obviously when I was quite a lot younger, which seem to point in that direction and can trigger a discussion. But if you pick up The Life You Can Save, you'll see that in the back I now have a suggested scale of giving, which, like a tax scale, the percentage that I suggest you give goes up as you have more. And I think that seems to me, so Toby Ord, when he started Giving What We Can, as I mentioned, he just had a flat 10% tithe. It's a nice round number. It's got some tradition in religious bodies and so on, so you can see why you would go for that. But obviously 10% for somebody who's earning $30,000 or $40,000 is much harder than for somebody who's earning $3 million. So that's why I think it's better to have a progressive giving scale. And I think if you look at what I've got in the book, you'll find it's not that difficult. So given that I'm not preaching abject poverty, it makes it a little harder, I guess, for those gotcha journalists to get me.
Peter was gifted a Breitling watch.
Breitling, yeah.
Breitling, did I say that correctly? For presenting a couple of years ago.
It's just one of these Swiss-made mechanical watches that people wear, and that I looked it up online. It was worth, I think, $8,000 US. And it was a Swiss organisation that was sponsored by Breitling that I was speaking at. So instead of a fee, I got this nice watch. Okay, you can now continue the story.
Which is currently in the process of being auctioned off if anyone wants to auction, and all the money will be donated to the Life You Can Save. So I'm not sure where the bidding's up to at the moment, but
I think it's up to $16,000 actually, which is pretty good. But if anybody wants the Breitling watch for twice as much as you could pay if you buy, in a way, I hope you don't want one. But if you do want one, this is an opportunity to have one and to know that your money will go to a good cause.
The microphone's not working, but you may go ahead with your question.
So what is the philosophical argument for moderating that? Why not go all the way? Like you've said that, none of us do, but why shouldn't we impoverish ourselves? Because wouldn't that be us taking our fair share of the resources that are available?
I think there's a good case for saying that if you say what ideally should we do, that would be the answer. I think yes, we should try to do the most good that we can, and that would mean that I guess for every decision we make, we think, does someone else need the money? Will someone benefit more from this money that I'm about to spend than I will benefit from purchasing whatever it is I was going to purchase? And if the answer is yes, they would, then you shouldn't have it yourself. And I know some people who've tried to live like that. There's a woman called Julia Wise who has a blog called Giving Gladly. You can have a look at, though most of it is some years old. She hasn't been keeping it up very much, but it's actually the early years that are interesting, because she was trying to do something like that, and she found it really was just too hard to live by, and she's a very committed person. And so the argument, and you said what's the philosophical argument, it's a kind of applied philosophical argument, is that if you try to make that the standard, you will end up with less money being donated to effective charities than if you have something more like the giving scale that I have in the Life You Can Save. And if the objective is to do as much good as we can through our advocacy and through our discussions of ethics and what we can do, then we'd be undercutting our own ultimate goal if we said, unless you give absolutely everything down to the point where the next dollar would make you worse off than it would do good for the other person. Unless you do that, you're a bad person. I think we'd just get a lot of people who would say, if morality is that demanding, I guess I just am a bad person and I'm going to have to live with that.
Like others in this room, Peter, I really enjoy the pragmatic application of your philosophical approaches, and most of the food and drink I've put in my body for many years has been sort of measured against those sorts of scales in ethics. One of the things that's been very popular in looking at things like global poverty are the Sustainable Development Goals, and it strikes me that what you're looking at from the financial dimension might have some strong relationships with that, and I'm just curious to know if the Life You Can Save has done any work in that area, because I know people want to make impact in those areas and work with organisations that can lift people up and improve our environment. So I was just curious, because that's a beautiful looking framework as well, so it's used a lot in storytelling and communications. So just curious of any relationship.
You're talking about the
there.
Sustainable Development Goals framework, are you? Or
Sorry?
are you talking about...
The global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17.
Yeah. 17 goals with a number of sub-goals in each one. I think somebody added it all up and said there's actually 169. I think, you know, the first of the Sustainable Development Goals is to end poverty, and we're clearly working for that. We are focusing on extreme poverty, as I said, defined by the World Bank as not having the resources to feed yourself and your family and do other basic things. And we're trying to help reduce the number of people in that situation. And that has declined quite a lot over, say, from I think 1990 when it was well over 1 billion, I think 1.4 billion around that time. And despite the fact that the world's population has grown, it got down to 736 million. So it got down to under 10% of the world's population after being at 40% at one point. The COVID pandemic put it up a little, so it went back up over 800, and I think it is now dropping again. So yes, you know, we're working on that as well, the first Sustainable Development Goal. As I mentioned, we are recommending some climate change organisations, which is clearly important for sustainable development. We are now looking at charities working in education, and education is another important Sustainable Development Goal. We have organisations that are helping women specifically. We have the Fistula Foundation, for example, that repairs obstetric fistulas, which are absolutely, you know, they're not lethal, but they're life-destroying conditions for young women who developed an obstetric fistula through giving birth in difficult conditions without medical assistance. So there's a lot of things that we can line up with the Sustainable Development Goals. But we haven't actually sort of all sat down and looked at the 17 goals and said, how can we support all 17 of them? We've rather focused on the things that we're familiar with, that we have charities that we either know to be highly effective or that we can set up ways of evaluating. And to look at it all would really be beyond our capacity.
I'm interested in the data that you use to assess the climate change organisations. Is that data around village relocation, health impacts of climate change, how many greenhouse gases the organisation helps to keep in the ground? You may or may not be able to answer to that.
It's more my understanding is it's more the last. It's how many greenhouse gas emissions are prevented or offset by protecting forests or something of that sort. But there may be somebody here who's been working in that area who can give a more detailed answer than I can. I don't know if any of the people with...
Well, just
yeah, go ahead.
You know, there's the impact too of community leveraging up to demand change, which is a hard one to judge, but can be really effective worldwide. So small organizations getting thousands of people motivated to push for, say, the US IRA, the impact of that is phenomenal, but it's not directly linked to emissions reductions.
Right. So it's much harder to assess organisations in terms of how good they are at doing that and what the effect of that is. Yeah. But have a look at the website, please. You can get more details on the organisations on the website than I have in my head.
Peter, I was just interested in the sort of research that you mentioned, and just there's some issues seem to be purely to me a bit like value of life. You know, do you help children before you help older people? And also, what about areas like the Horn of Africa with the kind of New Orleans problem? It's going to get wiped out again. So, do you rate that?
Well, we do want long-term change. So, you know, things that are stopgap and that where you can put resources in and they're likely to get wiped out again. We would unfortunately give lower priority to that. You know, you have to. It's a tragic situation for the people there, but you do want to have a lasting and enduring outcome for that situation. So that kind of case, I think we probably would treat that as a reason for not intervening in that area. Sorry, what was the other? There was another example that you were asking about before you mentioned that.
The value of life.
The value of, yeah, right. So the value of life issue is something that gets discussed quite a lot in terms of, for example, what kinds of diseases should be tackled by the World Health Organization. If they've got limited resources, which diseases should they focus on? And there is something called the Disability Adjusted Life Year, which is used to measure. Sometimes it's called the Quality Adjusted Life Year. They're related, doing similar things. And they have tried to put on a scale what on the one hand is complete loss of life and loss of years of life. So on that scale, the death of a child would weigh more heavily than the death of an older person who would have fewer years to live. But they also try to assess that in terms of how bad it is to have certain kinds of disabilities. And that has been attempted to be measured by asking people questions. And the questions might take the form of, suppose that you were in a situation where, let's say, that you were, use the example of visual impairment. Let's say you were you had no vision, you were blind. And you could have an operation which would have a certain percentage chance of restoring your sight, but a certain smaller percentage chance that you would die in the course of the operation. So would you have that operation? And the answer might depend on how many years of sight will I still have, and also, of course, what are the odds that I won't survive the operation? So by asking that type of question, economists in the health field have tried to establish what people's preferences are in terms of, some people might say, well, if I was going to have 20 years of sight, then I would take let's say 50% chance of dying in order to have another 20 years of sight. But I wouldn't if I was only going to have 5 years of sight. So that gives you some sense of how they're making these adjustments. It's controversial. A lot of people say, you're not getting really relevant answers. Some people say you should focus on the people who have the particular disability and not just ask the public at large. So all of those questions are still up for debate. But there are organisations, including I think the World Health Organization, that does make some use of these to try to estimate for each disease what they call the global burden of disease is for that disease, and then target the ones where you can, for the least cost, reduce the global burden by the greatest amount.
Would you comment on the role of animal agriculture in climate change, poverty, and how that fits into, if at all, in the world of the life you can save?
I'm very happy to comment on that, yes. Generally speaking, animal agriculture is not good either for feeding people or for the climate. Now, they're somewhat different in those different areas. As far as feeding people is concerned, if you have grasslands where you're living and humans cannot digest grass, but cows and sheep can, then having grazing animals does increase the availability of food. And that's relevant for some peoples. The downside of it is that it's particularly those animals who can digest grass, the ruminant animals, who release a lot of methane as part of their digestion process. And methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, depending a little on what time frame you're looking at. It's at least 27 times as potent as carbon dioxide, and over a shorter time frame, even more so. So that's a big factor, I think, in terms of ruminant animals eating grass. The other thing that's important to recognise is that the majority of the animal products that people eat are not coming from that kind of situation anymore. They're coming from intensive farms, factory farms, confined animal feeding operations, as the industry likes to call them. But essentially what you're doing is you're taking the animals off the grass, off the fields. You're confining them either indoors in sheds, in the case of smaller animals, chickens and pigs in particular, or in feedlots in the case of beef cattle, especially when we're sort of producing beef for the American market, which likes a more fatty kind of beef that you get by feeding grain to cattle in feedlots. And when you do that, you are actually reducing the amount of food available for human consumption, because we're feeding grains, sometimes we feed soybeans, sometimes we feed fish meal. These are all products which humans can digest and eat, and when you feed them to animals, you lose the majority of the food value for each species. The ratio varies. Beef is the least effective. You lose at least 90% of the food value if you feed wheat to beef or soy to beef. Chickens laying eggs are relatively highly efficient, but you still, as I say, lose the majority. I think close to 2/3 of the food value, even when you're doing that. So there's a real problem, therefore, in trying to produce more food, but feeding it for the animals. And you know, it's kind of ironic. You probably have been reading over the last year or so that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused a food crisis because Ukraine has been a major wheat producer, and for a time Russia was blockading Ukrainian ships exporting, and even now it's not quite what it was. That's true, and that's a very bad thing. But in fact, the amount of grain that Ukraine can produce is far less than the amount of grain that the United States produces and feeds to animals, and that other countries produce and feed to animals, and essentially waste the majority of, especially when they're feeding to beef cattle as a huge quantity. So this is not a sustainable activity. It's bad for the climate, it's bad for feeding people, and of course it's really bad for the animals who are confined. If you want to read more about this, I'll put in a little plug. I have a new edition of Animal Liberation. It's going to be called Animal Liberation Now. It's the first really fully revised edition since the second edition in 1990. It'll be published in Australia on June the 13th. And people say, well, what's different from the earlier editions? Well, obviously a lot has happened in factory farming and use of animals in experiments since 1990. But one thing that has happened is I'm much more aware of climate change than I was in 1990, as most people are. And so there's a lot more discussion, and those figures that I gave you and references, sources for them are in the new edition.
That's it for questions. We are running exactly to time. Very grateful for questions. Thank you, Peter, in particular, for speaking to us. I, for one, have found it enthralling to hear you bring to life the concepts that I've read in the books, Animal Liberation, and also The Life You Can Save. And immensely grateful you said yes when I asked you to speak at this event. So thank you very much. Peter will be staying around for another half an hour to keep mingling. I'd just like to finish off with a couple of other thank yous and a bit of another plug for The Life You Can Save. If you've been moved by some of the ideas that have been talked about tonight, if you read the book, and it also does what it did to me and my husband, who's over there, and just makes you just open up your wallet and go, here, take my money, I'm going to donate now. Please visit, share it with your friends and family. One of the best ways to promote a culture of giving in this country, of which Australia is quite poor in terms of the amount we give per capita as a percentage of GDP compared to other countries, is really poor. The best way to help create that culture of giving is to talk about it. Talk about it with your friends and family. Talk about who you're giving to and why, which charities and why. That's one thing. And if the book has inspired you to do that, share the book. There's a copy here for you to take away. If you want another one, get in contact with me. I'll get it to you. It's a really great read and inspired me no end. So visit our website, check out the calculator, follow us on socials, all of those things, and contact me if you have any questions. I'll send a follow-up email shortly in the next week. But just to wrap up, big thank you to all of my volunteers who helped bring this night together. Thank you to the Wyatt Trust. Thank you to Magella Wines for donating the wines that we're enjoying this evening. Thank you to suppliers, Sonda Creative, and also Chef Gregory, who created the menu that you've been enjoying as well, fully plant-based feast. So please, that's it from me. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. Go and grab another drink, have some food, mingle, and enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you.